And we'll start off with Quinyon Mitchell. And so we'll sort of break this down into some of their physical attributes, stats, and then we'll get into some strengths and weaknesses from the film. So here is Quinyon Mitchell's spider chart. He is 6 foot tall, which is 66th percentile among cornerbacks, 195 pounds, which is 61st percentile. He ran a 4.33 40-yard dash, which is 95th percentile, with a 38-inch vertical leap that is 74th percentile. He has 34th percentile arm length, 95th percentile hand size, and overall he had a 9.79 relative athletic score, which basically means he is 97.9th percentile among all cornerbacks tested when you coalesce the athleticism scores with the height weight. So very athletic cornerback. A few stats I'll throw your way here, and then we'll get into the film. Over the last 2 seasons, Quinyon Mitchell led college football in forced incompletions with 44. In 2023, he was PFF's highest graded cornerback in man coverage and their 4th highest graded cornerback in zone coverage. And he does not get flagged. He only had 1 defensive pass interference, 2 total penalties called on him in the last 2 seasons combined. Over the course of his career, he played 1,790 snaps at boundary cornerback, and he played 100 snaps in the slot. In 2023, he was targeted 59 times, and he allowed 26 receptions, which is a 44% completion rate, for 282 yards and 0 touchdowns, with 1 interception and 12 passes defensed. He also had only a 6.7% missed tackle rate in 2023. That is dramatically down from a 14.3% missed tackle rate in 2022. And all those charting stats come from PFF, just to credit the sources there if you've seen different charting metrics from different places. So that's sort of the stats and physical profile of Quinyon Mitchell. Jonny's written great articles about all 3 of these guys that are on Bleeding Green Nation, and you can go read his full articles there. We're going to sort of use those as a template, and we'll show some film here. But Jonny, why don't you take me through a couple of the biggest strengths you saw when you watched Quinyon Mitchell on film?
Yeah, so I think what we'll do is we've always said this podcast is a slight extension of my writing as well, because obviously I can't make up stuff different to the podcast and I write. So maybe if you want like the full thing, we don't need to go through every single strength. What we'll do is we'll highlight a few key ones. You mentioned actually a few of the key ones, which are the numbers in terms of pass breakups and lack of pass interference as well. That's huge. And the way I do this as well, just a little peek behind the curtain, is I watch as many as I can pre-draft, but I'm not watching a huge amount pre-draft because I can only get to 2-3 games. But post-draft, I can just go nuts because I've only got 10 players to watch. So I do change opinions. Sometimes I watch players back and really change my opinion on them. Sometimes it's just very similar. Quinyon Mitchell's film is like awesome. And I'm not saying that because he was drafted him, because I'm very happy to be critical of players when I don't see it. Like the film is just really, really good. I don't think we need to show anything about the speed, about the height, weight, speed, like length. We know all that stuff. Like that's all very, very obvious. I want to talk about and the off coverage first of all, because I think this is something that links to Vic Fangio's scheme in particular. So if you have a look, Shane, the article where it says excels in off coverage, there are a couple of clips, one that I posted myself actually, which is pretty freaky, where he like runs past the ball at the break point. And it's one of those things that when you see it, you don't see it very often. It's one of those plays where he is in off coverage and he is essentially, it's just the curl route in front of him. But the speed in which he reads it is one thing, but the speed to actually come downhill and play it is absurd. This is something, as Shane's got the clip up now, you just don't see this very often. Like it almost looks weird because I think some of it's because the ball's thrown behind him. But to say you hear the phrase very sort of classic, he runs the route better than the receiver. He literally does. He outruns this. And I think what Vic Fangio asks his cornerbacks to do a lot is play that vertical plane, which I think he's very, very comfortable. He's very comfortable running deep. Deep posts, the kind of things you have to cover a lot in quarters, because if they play tricks opposite him, he may end up one-on-one with the receiver. And one of the hardest covers for a cornerback playing outside cornerback in the Vic Fangio defense is covering deep posts. So when I was watching him, I was really looking carefully for this. There's another clip you're just showing now of that click and close, which is like really, really good. Like the speed in which he drives on the ball, that 5-yard burst, it's why testing matters. Anyone that argues that testing doesn't matter is nonsense, because of course it matters. And you want to see corners that run extremely quickly, especially in the 5-10 yards. Then my other clip, Shane, that I loved, and sorry, you can show that one first if you want. Go for it.
No, go ahead.
Was the Senior Bowl. I really like Senior Bowl footage because you get so many good camera angles that you don't see elsewhere. So I only tweeted one clip, or in the article I've got one clip, with him playing Roman Wilson. And I believe they had a very physical, competitive game. And I love clips like this. There's something about watching. It's almost like you're there. These kind of clips from like the iPhone in the crowd. And the fluidity to his, like, if for those watching on screen, it's a stop and go route. And he just runs with Roman Wilson. And Roman Wilson's a very good route runner. And he just runs with him. It's so effortless. Everything is easy. There's a phrase I like, or a scouting term, like hands and feet in sync. And it's hard to describe what it is, but you know it when you see it. And the way I define it is just everything looks fluid. Some players, I mean, just human beings, look out of sync when they run. Things are not coordinated. His hands, his feet, his arm, they're all lined up. This is such a lovely play. And as I said, I like the fact it's almost like you're there. So I've got a few Senior Bowl clips, actually, with Jalix Hunt as well. So there's lots of things we could talk about, but they're the big things for me. I think carrying post routes, carrying vertical routes, click and close speed from off coverage. And then I think just the natural fluidity of how athletic he is as an individual. He feels like, I mean, I always think when I think of scouting, is like, how does he bust? We'll maybe come on to weaknesses, but in terms of like him as a prospect, like it's really good. He's better than a top 20 player. He would have gone earlier if it wasn't for some of the things we'll talk about with the weaknesses, in particular, level of competition, because you can't avoid that. If you had a corner at Alabama who has the tape and the traits that he has, he goes drafted top 10, top 15, because when I think of cornerbacks who bust, and I think of like your D. Milners of the world, or who did the Browns take, who the Eagles sign, Greedy Williams, they're often freak athletes who can't play the ball. They're freak athletes who move really well, but don't win at the catch point. Quinyon Mitchell was like the opposite. He's a freak athlete who is as good as it gets at the catch point. When you see like 44 pass breaks up over 2 years, that's nonsense, really. That's all borderline ridiculous. So to do that, as well as being the height, weight, speed prospect he is, he ticks both boxes. He ticks the production and he ticks the athletic box. So, yeah, I'm incredibly optimistic about this. I think cornerback's one of the hardest positions to transition to, and I think Fangio in particular, because you've got to know when to keep in man coverage, what we might call Meg or something, when you're going to line up one-on-one, or when you are going to let the receiver go if he runs like a crossing route. It's not an easy defense to learn for an outside corner, but I expect him to start, and I expect him to look pretty good early on. He will get beat by good receivers because it's the NFL and there's some extremely good receivers in there, and he does have some things to clean up on, but I think his film is, for a corner prospect, like as solid as it gets, really. I've not seen a lot of better film in the past few years personally.
Yeah, his film is really clean. And you talked about his click and close. And I believe we showed this clip previously on a podcast, but it's Toledo against Illinois. And this is the one that gets the slow motion view from the back to see him breaking on a slant route. And so if you look to the bottom of the screen here, it's hard to see on the first one because the scoreboard's in the way. But on the replay, you can see this is Quinyon Mitchell in the bottom right corner of the screen. And if you watch slow motion, the way the click and close, he perfectly arrives as the ball's getting there to get the pass breakup. I mean, just watch his footwork in this. His head's over his toes, weight's up on his toes. Now it's not playing for some reason, which is just great when you try to do things with film live on a podcast. So
it's also great in slow motion. Slow motion.
Yeah, it's like, there we go. He's waits over his toes. He drives down and he meets the ball at the catch point. And it's such a good play. And it's not just, I mean, again, anybody can like put together a highlight reel of a few plays to prove a point, but that stuff's all over his tape. He's really good, to click and close. And it's something that, he played a lot of off coverage, and we're going to talk about that when we get into some of the limitations, potentially some of the weaknesses, but he played a lot of off coverage. He's so good at just patiently waiting on the route to break. Sometimes maybe he waits too long and he trusts his makeup speed a bit too much to make up, because when you play off coverage, you're typically putting your heels at 7-10 yards, whatever your landmark is going to be, and you're reading out the receiver so you can be up on your toes and break down if it's a route breaking, And if it's not, then you open your hips and turn and run. And sometimes he waits a bit long to try to open his hips and turn and run. And he could get away with that at Toledo because he just has such elite speed. I do think that he'll have to be willing to turn and run a little quicker at the next level, because that aggressiveness will get him burned by some of the faster receivers that he'll play against. But he's so good at reading those routes out in front, knowing when to break, knowing when to make contact at the catch point. I think that's one of his more impressive traits. And I think it's why Toledo played him off so much. He was just so good with that click and close.
Yeah, you mentioned route recognition there as well. That's something that you noticed in a lot of the slow-mo clips, the one you posted earlier. Like, he sort of has an innate sense of what's going to happen. I think he really understands the position, which is so important for cornerback. I mean, when corners get older, they can survive without the speed because they read things so well. Yeah, you mentioned flipping the hips. I'm sure many listeners have an idea of what we mean by that, but essentially if you're running a vertical route against him, sort of the later you can turn and run, the better. Because what receivers are trying to do is they're trying to close that gap as quickly as possible. If they're running a comeback route, they want you to turn and run so they can then come back to the football. He is willing to leave it to a last minute before turning and before flipping his hips, which is what I think you're on about. But this is where testing matters. When you run a 4.33, he's got deep speed. If he does, he doesn't need to turn and run too early because he knows he can trust his speed. And it could be that, you're right, the occasional receiver gets the better of him where he gets overly aggressive. But I think for the most part, that's not a huge concern. I know this clip as well, because I'm pretty sure this might be from my article as well. This is the one where he pushes him out of bounds just ever so slightly. And I love sort of the understanding of where he is on the field as well. We talk about like this idea of like understanding where you're playing. He understands they're in the red zone here. He knows he's got a lot of ground to cover, and he just sort of effortlessly pushes him out. And then once again, the ability to play the football, Shane, that's what gets me really excited. I get fed up with corners who run really well and can't play the ball in the air. He is the exact opposite of that. Like, the way he goes up and gets this is textbook. So it's awesome. I don't really have any other strengths, Shane, to be honest, that I was desperate to throw out there. So do you want to talk through this play? Because I feel like you're itching to get something in particular.
Yeah, I was just going to give an example here of what we're talking about with playing off coverage and flipping the hips. And so Quinyon Mitchell's, 8 to 10 yards off of the line of scrimmage here. And you'll notice at the snap, he's not flat-footed, but he's not retreating. You're just sort of there, slowly shuffling back. And once this receiver clears, if this is a slant route, we're breaking here, right? If it's an out route, we're breaking about the 20-yard line. And so he's watching those. And once the receiver clears these landmarks, once he passes the 20, now we flip the hips and we're going to turn and run downfield. And that's what we're talking about, flipping the hips. And he's really fluid doing that. And I would argue sometimes he's waits a little long to flip those hips, and it's trusting in that speed. But it also just stems from that aggressiveness, wanting to break downhill and make a play. So if you weren't sure what we're talking about when we talk flipping your hips, that's what we're talking about.
So Shane, go back to the start of this play one more time. I knew this would happen. We go way too in depth, but this is actually the best example, and I didn't realize. Pause it now. When I spoke about earlier on about there's lots of different coverage, mod or meg. I don't really care about the technicalities of what you want to call it, but essentially, what quite often happens in quarter or whatever defense you want to call it, Vic Fangio, quarters, whatever, split safety. This is a really good example. You can see they've got the plane of 4, so it looks like there are 4 defensive backs almost in a line. But what teams will often do now is essentially they want to be 5 over. In this case, I think I'm trying to add up. My maths is bad.
I think it's
5 over 3, 6 over 3, or whatever. And basically, the safety that would normally help out that quarterback on an island doesn't anymore. He will take the free receiver if he comes across. Fangio calls it tricks. It's a very fancy way of essentially what it basically does is it means that when you're the outside cornerback, you are literally one-on-one. If you look at this play for Quinyon Mitchell, talk about being a one-on-one coverage, Shane. There is no one 20 yards away from him. This receiver can go anywhere. He can go, as you said, slant, post, in, come back. This is the receiver's dream. This is where you want an AJ Brown, an ex-receiver. This is like what you live for. You basically want to have no one else around you. This is like backyard football, one-on-one. Defensive coordinators don't call this play unless they trust their outside cornerback, because this is a pure matchup play. So this is awesome. Just as you were playing it, I was thinking it's a perfect example of what we were talking about earlier on. And Austin commented in the chat about the hands jabbing at the ball and breaking up. Yeah, that's what we mean when we talk about the 44 pass breakups. Like, it's really natural. The fact that you can get 44 pass breakups and then like 1 pass interference penalty in 2 years feels impossible. Like, it almost feels too good to be true, because you either think you're going to be overly aggressive and then constantly jump and get called for pass interference, or you're not going to get many breakups. He is the opposite. So he had 0 penalties in 2023. I think you may have said this earlier on. If you did, apologies. And 1 pass interference in 2022. So you've got the most pass breakups in however you want to categorize it, 44 pass breakups the past 2 years, and 1 pass interference penalty the last 2 years. Like, you don't have to be brain of Britain here. It's an English phrase, sorry. You don't have to be too intelligent, shall we say, to realize that 44 pass breakups and 1 pass interference in 2 years is pretty absurd. It's pretty freaky. Right, should we get very, very quickly, before this is a 5-hour podcast on Quinyon Mitchell by himself? Did you want to talk very quickly about the weaknesses? And I'll give you my main one, I think, for next year, what we'll see.
Yeah, real quick, let's answer this question. Austin asks if Quinyon can play in the slot. Not that that's the plan. Just curious. I'll give my take first. Not experienced in the slot, only had 100 snaps in the slot. I don't see a reason that he couldn't, because what you want from a slot defender is you want quickness, right? And you want a guy that's willing to stick his nose in the fan and run defense. And I think Quinyon Mitchell has the fluidity to defend to. Well, I say that it really depends on what you want out of your slot, because sometimes you want a bigger guy in the slot to be able to body tight ends. And so you need some flexibility, but I think he's got the fluidity. He's not the best tackler of running backs, but he's willing. And that's not uncommon at the next level for corner. You want a corner that's willing, even if they're not that great a tackler yet. You can develop that. So I think he could play in the slot. I'd be very surprised if you see him there next year, though, because I think he's going to be really good outside.
Yeah, he's not a slot cornerback. Could he do it? Yes. Traits-wise, yes. Fangio defense style, waste. Massively wasted. Run defense is too important these days for nickel corners. Right, seeing as I mentioned it, I'll jump in, Shane. Just very, very quickly, weaknesses, because to be honest, there's not a great deal. The obvious one is school and players he played against. You can't get away from the fact he's not playing against top athletes. Benny mentioned about the change of direction. I think, no, I wouldn't say I'm that worried about it, to be honest. I guess the query is the way he played sort of 5-7 yards off. We didn't really see him pressing up a line of scrimmage. We didn't see him like turn and run with slants that often, but I didn't see it, if I'm honest. The issues I had were 2 of them. Number one, hands in press, because he just didn't get the opportunity to do it a lot. So how he gave so much cushion. It may be that he's not asked to press very much at the Eagles anyway, so it doesn't really matter. I'm also going to call nonsense on PFF's run defense stat. I don't care if they say 6% missed tackle rate. I didn't like the tackling technique. Fair enough. It may be it may have worked last year in college from coming from a smaller school, but the way he tackles will lead to missed tackles in the NFL. Like, I watched the first 2 games I watched, he just didn't wrap up at all. He dives a lot with his shoulder, sort of dives at ankles a lot, and every so often he gets lucky and wins. But I was shocked when I saw that PFF tackle percentage and missed tackle, because I thought it would be much higher. And then when I realized what it was the year before, yeah, I don't believe he improved his missed tackle rate that much. This is a clip from my article that I showed. Basically, if you want to know what he tackles, just watch this. There is 0 attempt to wrap up. That is a dive at the ankles if I ever saw one. And that was not the only one I saw, which is another reason why I don't want him in the slot. As Benny mentioned, he's better vertically than he is laterally, and I agree with that, which is what we're talking about, him being a classic outside corner, carrying posts, carrying vertical routes. The good thing about playing a Fangio's defense is I don't really care if they can run with like drag routes and stuff, because they barely have to. If a team is running mesh, you just let him go, you shout under, and the slot corner will pick him up. So you're basically playing on a vertical plane a lot. So how many times do you see Darius Slay line up and like run with slants and run with it just doesn't really happen in this style of defense that often. So I worry a lot less about that. That was my big one, was tackling, because I think tackling is a massive part of playing a defensive back these days. One thing that teams do a lot against the Eagles with Darius Slay and Bradbury is they'll line up 3 receivers on one side and then the tight end to the lone side, what we call like a nub set. And then they'll run at that tight end side. And the reason why is because the Eagles are playing a lot of zone, which means they won't move their corners around, which essentially means your outside cornerback on that side has to play in the run fit. And a lot of teams did that against the Eagles, and I expect them to continue to do that because either one of Slay or Quinyon Mitchell will be a target for opposition teams in the running game. But that's the only real weaknesses I've got. And to be honest, tackling technique is not top of my priority list when I'm looking at first round corners.
Yeah, Austin said, "How dare you question PFF, Jonny?" And
I do apologize.
That comment made me chuckle, and I almost started to ask you if you like The Office, but then I realized if you do, you wouldn't like the same version of The Office that I've watched. But for the Americans out here, it reminds me of the clip in The Office where Kelly is like, "First of all, how dare you?" But anyways, I got a chuckle out of that. You mentioned his press rate. He actually had the second lowest press rate in the last 5 years. He only played 20 snaps in press coverage in 2023. And what's interesting is the corner opposite him, Toledo's other outside corner, played a lot of press. So it's not like it's just something Toledo doesn't do. I have a theory, and I mean, we'll never know. I mean, maybe we'll know if he's really good in press coverage right out the gate. Not that the Eagles are going to do that a lot, but I just have a theory that playing in the MAC, if he was pressing guys, he would have been so dominant. You just never throw his way. And when you have a guy that's a first-round NFL draft pick in the MAC, you probably want to incentivize teams throwing his way. So I do wonder if that was like a coaching point that like, hey, we're going to play you off because we want teams to test you. Maybe it was a him preference. Maybe he's not as comfortable in press. I don't know. We'll have to see it play out, but it's the classic. He wasn't asked to do it. I don't think that necessarily means that he'll be bad at it. But the other thing I wanted to mention, and I'll show a clip here, that this is a bad rep from the Senior Bowl against Roman Wilson. And so we'll just run it here. And you see he's stumbling all over himself, and Roman Wilson's wide open, and it's a bad throw, right? But one thing I think it shows here, and it's something that I saw at times from him, is kind of in his back pedal, he tends to get his weight over his heels at times. And so if you kind of watch this is a place you never want to be as a cornerback. You want your weight over your toes so you can react. And you can see he's leaned over backwards, his weight's over his heels, and he stumbles out of this break. Now, this isn't something he does all the time. Like sometimes there's just a bad rep, and we showed the one earlier that's perfect, right? And if we kind of freeze frame as he's leaning backwards here, and I switch back to this other one against Roman Wilson. Look where his weight's at in these two. Look where his weight is, head over toes right here versus head back over your heels here. And so there's a little bit of inconsistencies in that, but that's something I noticed from time to time when he struggles, especially to like flip his hips and run. A lot of times I thought it was because he got his weight back on his heels instead of going from weight on the toes to opening those hips to run. So that's just a little technical thing, a little technique thing that I picked up on. And again, we're nitpicking, but you kind of do have to nitpick if you're not just going to dismiss him for playing in the MAC or say he can't play press, because really his technique's really good mostly.
Yeah, and also the whole point of this podcast is to be in depth. It's like the whole point of the show. So if you don't want half an hour on Quinyon Mitchell, apologies. I would say that firstly, you are 100% spot on. I saw that rep as well. I love the Senior Bowl reps, man. I absolutely love them. You can see so much technique stuff. I think the problem with press coverage numbers as well is people have a funny definition of press. So when you just say press, they think Madden, and you stand there with two hands and shove the receiver. Like you can play mirror match press where you don't actually make any contact with the receiver. I don't know if he's that good at that technique. So I think that's a flaw where he just wasn't asked to play a lot of mirror match. And basically what I mean by that is you're almost up as if you're going to press, but you don't actually stick hands on the receiver, but you still stay very close to him. I think he's so much better 5-10 yards off. I think that technique issue is because he doesn't do it very often. And at the Senior Bowl, what do coaches want you to do things that we don't see very often on film, because that's the whole point. There's no point seeing Quinyon Mitchell playing 10 yards deep because we know he can do it. The film doesn't lie. So what do I want to see? Do you know what? Line up against a receiver that can go both ways, and I want to see your mirror match technique. And I think that's something that he will have to learn early on. I think the best news for him, though, is that he's going to walk into a system that will ask him to line up in off quite a lot. But I think it's fair to point out, if you want him to be a top corner, you have to be able to do different things. Some receivers, they're very poor at beating press coverage. You may want to press them. Some receivers that struggle with mirror and match technique, you may want to get close to the line of scrimmage. Certain receivers, perfect, stand 10 yards deep. So you have to, the best corners could obviously change their technique week on, week out based on who they're playing against. And I think that is something that he will have to learn if he wants to be a very, very good corner, is being able to play different techniques, because the numbers suggest he's basically an off coverage corner only at this point. But I'm not too worried because of the Eagles' defensive scheme, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. And had a comment here from Benny saying it's a good call out on the technique. Hopefully he can get coached up on that. And, I fully expect that to happen. So much of coaching, especially if you're going to get rookies on the field, you have to find what they do well and play into that strength while identifying those weaknesses and coaching that up. And that's where I think he's such a good fit with the Fangio scheme. The Fangio scheme's not going to press a lot. And so it's going to play to his strengths early. But that doesn't mean you don't identify and work on those weaknesses. And there's nothing that on tape, at least, that indicates to me that he's incapable of playing press coverage and learning it. I mean, he's a fluid athlete, good hands, all that. So I fully believe that's something that he can do. Austin also says he wants 2.5 hours on Quinyon Mitchell. I'm not currently equipped to do a 2.5 hour show on Quinyon Mitchell because I'm all out of clips that I wanted to show, but